Thank you for attending our Writers Coffee House. Originally, we planned to be in a coffee house, but we want to make sure that we help keep everyone safe. So we are doing Zoom, but if you feel that after this event, there should be a series and there you would benefit from having access to more information from Dr. James and Dr. Custis James, we are more than open to have another event following this event, if there's more information that you can glean from our two guests. So Carolyn has traveled widely to speak at colleges, universities, seminars, and churches all over the world, and was named one of the 50 women to watch by Christianity Today in 2013. She was the founder of the Synergy Women's Network, a contributing editor for Leadership Journal, and continues to serve as a consulting editor for Zondervan's exegetical commentary series on the New Testament. Dr. James is president and professor of historical theology at Missio Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He formerly served as provost and professor of historical theology at Gordon Conwell, and he studied under Alistair McGrath for his DPhil at Oxford University and added a second PhD in theology from Westminster Theological Seminary. He has authored over 9 books and numerous academic articles. Between the two, they have authored over 16 books and counting, and we are just extremely blessed and grateful to hear from them and be able to let our spirits and just experience and receive their wisdom and the knowledge that they're going to share with us this evening. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. James so he can please pray before we get started. But thank you everyone for joining us. Dr. James.
Let's do pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for just the opportunity to be together. And we pray, Father, that this will be a time where there will be encouragement and thoughtfulness and engagement. We lift this hour up to you and ask that you would bless each of those who are participating, and may it just be a good time for all of us. I pray in Jesus' precious name, amen.
Amen.
Well, our goal tonight is really just to talk about the trials and tribulations of a writer's life in a way. There are joys, great joys, but there are challenges as well. And so we want to make sure we cover all of that tonight. Talk about writing and talk about the writing process, talk about audiences and publishing. At least we can get started talking about that tonight. I always prefer in these kinds of circumstances that we be very informal. I don't view this as some sort of formal thing, but I'm more than happy for anyone to raise their hand if they've got a question, and we can stop with whatever sort of we've got on tap, and we can try to respond to that. So I'm looking forward to that. The plan tonight, I sort of see it in 3 parts. One is, I wanted just to tell you a little bit about our story, how each of us got involved in writing. I don't know that either of us had originally planned to be writers. That wasn't the goal per se, but there were certain circumstances. The Lord moved in powerful ways. And so we ended up both devoting a good part of our lives to writing. And the second thing is we want to talk a little bit about the writing life and the challenges that come with writing, always having to juggle different responsibilities. How do you deal with editors and the like? And the third part is we thought we'd try to give some tips for writing, things that are practical, that might be helpful for those who are even thinking about writing, even your academic papers at seminary. We thought that might be good. One of the first things I wanted to say before I, bring Carolyn on is that we have different audiences, Carolyn and I. We write to different audiences by and large. We write different ways. Let me give you a quick story to illustrate this. When my daughter was we were living in Orlando at the time, and she was about 14 or 15, something like that. And she and some friends of hers were coming over, and my daughter very appropriately introduced her parents to these friends who came over. And she introduced her mother, Carolyn, as a writer, someone that a lot of people read. And she said, and my father writes books too, but not very many people read them. and that really does illustrate the different audiences. My career in writing has largely been in that sort of academic world, very specialized areas of writing, focusing really, late medieval Reformation has been my specialty. And so if you go to some of the books I've written, they're full of Latin in the footnotes and German, and it's not bedtime reading for most people. Carolyn, on the other hand, has written and been read widely. She's won awards for her writing. And it's been interesting that Carolyn has written, and she's walked a very kind of interesting edge. On the one hand, she writes for a broad audience. Her books are what are called mass marketed books for the publisher. And so they widely, promote those to a large variety of people. But all of her work has an academic sort of orientation. She's a biblical scholar. And so that means that when she writes on issues, and she writes mainly about the relationship of men and women, that she does them from a biblical perspective. But there seems to be a fair amount of interest in the relationship of men and women. And so her books have done pretty well over the years. So let me sort of, that's sort of a brief introduction. Can I ask Carolyn, would you just share with everybody sort of the story of how you began writing? Because that wasn't what you were planning exactly. So you want to share that story?
No, I had no thought of writing, but it goes way back. Just to give you a little bit of background on me, I'm a pastor's daughter. I have 3 brothers, no sisters. My mom always lamented that I grew up in a boys' dorm, and I did. There were things that I missed out on because I didn't have a sister. But one of the things that really was a jolt to me was when I went off to college, and there was such a difference between what I was getting from my Bible professor, who's a reputable scholar, and his classes were just rich. And then what would happen when we had a women's brunch and had a speaker. And the first time I went to a women's brunch there at the college, I was horrified at the level of the message that was being communicated to us. And that there was such, it's sort of like you go into the Christian bookstore and they used to say, the pink section is for women. And that was just infuriating to me. And what got me started in writing was when we came back from Oxford and we were in Florida and Frank was teaching at the seminary there. I was invited to speak to the women of the seminary. So it had been female students, wives of students, and faculty and staff women. And so I spoke on the importance of theology for women. And I wasn't talking about theology in a real heady way. I was just saying, when the bottom drops out of your life, the theology you reach for is your own. You're not going to reach for your pastor's theology. You're not going to reach for, your husband, if you have a husband, or your brother or your father. You're going to reach for whatever it is you believe about God. And whether it's true or false, whether it's a little or a lot. And I told the story of one of my best high school friends who had gone through a long battle with infertility when she got married. And, I would go meet with her and she would just be in tears over it. And she finally had a baby. And this little boy was a year old, and they went on a picnic along the banks of the Sandy River in Oregon, where we grew up. And her husband and another guy who was there, another husband, took the baby out into the water to play. And her husband was holding the baby, and he stepped into a hole in the riverbank and lost his footing, and he pushed the baby toward his friend, and his friend didn't see this coming, and she watched her baby swept away in the river. And and I say in the book, the first book that I wrote, the moment the word why crosses your lips, you're doing theology. And the response from the women in that session, because there were, like I said, there were seminary students who were female. There were women who were married to students who, some of them were very, struggling with how all the family money was going to tuition and books. And they were away from their families. And so they were struggling. And the response to that was just way more than I ever imagined. And that was sort of the beginning of what I do, because I started, when they would graduated, I started getting invitations to speak at their women's conferences. And I kept getting this, the phone call or the email or whatever it was would say, we want something deeper. And so I was doing these little retreats. One time it was 10 women in a trailer, and one time it was over 300. It was just, whatever. And the publishers come to the seminary to see what the faculty are up to, and if there's a manuscript they can get their hands on before their competitor does. And so Stan Gundry, who's the editor-in-chief at Zondervan, was meeting with Frank, and Frank got me into trouble. He said, I think you might be interested in what my wife is doing. So he said, well, tell her to submit a proposal. And so I submitted a proposal to him on a book about the importance of theology for women. And the argument of that book was that the first great New Testament theologian was a woman. And when he got the proposal, he liked it, but he said, you've got to get this through 2 committees. And they're mostly men. And the one committee that gives the contract is all male. And it was just a battle. I mean, the first thing that happened was I got a rejection letter. And so I took the letter to Frank and I said, well, there you go. They don't want to publish this. And he said, so if it's important it's worth fighting for. What are you going to do? Which I didn't expect to hear. So I contacted Stan and just asked for his advice. And I told him I didn't think the editor who turned me down understood what I was trying to do. And he said to me, that's not the kind of book we publish for women. And they had just released a title for women that was Devotions, D-U-H. And I said, we're already reading books like this. They're written by men and they don't talk to us, so anyway, it was a long battle. The editor came back, it was a male editor, became a very strong advocate. They both did. And, the publishers always want to know how big your tribe is. And I'm thinking, well, there's my mother. I didn't have a big tribe. I wasn't anybody. And they just took a risk. So that's how I got started. And should I stop there? Is that enough, Frank?
Sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, that was the beginning, and it's been a great ride since. I mean, every book has led to another book.
But they're not books. I wanted to write a book for women that men would read.
Yeah.
Because men don't read women's books, and some of us don't either. And I even had an elder in my church tell me, he said, I know you wrote this book for women. I didn't read it for women. I read it for myself. Because it was it's the same issue for them. We all are in this process of needing to know God better than we do. And, and that was my goal. I wanted to write books for women, but I wanted to write books for women that men would read. So
it's been interesting. I've noticed that a lot of men have endorsed Carolyn's work because it's serious work designed for a broad audience, but it's serious. And I can assure you that Carolyn has done an enormous amount of writing, of research as she does her work. And so again, in Carolyn's case, that's her story about how it happened. It wasn't that she set out. It was just that she had a husband who was just getting her in trouble, as she says. My story about writing, and I probably did have some aspirations for writing. I was an English minor in college. And so I've always loved words and sentences, and have always enjoyed that. But that's different from being an academic writer. And my first book, there's a fascinating story about that. I was a PhD student, and here in Philadelphia, at Westminster Seminary. And what happened was I'd gotten a job out in California as a professor, even before I finished my PhD in Westmont College in Santa Barbara. Beautiful, wonderful, incredible Santa Barbara, California. And I went to a conference, an academic conference, and there at the conference was probably, well, more than probably, he was the greatest Reformation scholar in half a century. I mean, he was the biggest gun around. His name was Heiko Obermann. He taught at Tübingen and Harvard, but he was the big gun in Reformation studies. And, I was young and impulsive and incredibly bold. I had read all of his writings, or many of his writings, and I realized that one of one of the people that he looked to that was an influence on him was an Augustinian monk whose name was Damasus Trapp. And when I was teaching at Villanova University, before going to California, I ran into Damasus Trapp, who was an elderly, superb scholar, not as well known, not nearly as well known as Obermann. And I realized in the course of my conversation that he never had what's called a Festschrift, which is a book that honors a scholar for their contributions to the field. Anyway, I walked up to Obermann, who's 6'5" and about 240. He's a towering figure physically as well as academically. And I said, look, I've got an idea. I've got a project for you. I'd like you to think about this. I'd like you to write this book. I'm writing this book, and I'd like you to publish it. And amazingly enough, he didn't say, are you crazy? You're just a kid. He actually took my name and number, and he wrote me and he said, I like your idea. He said, I will do more than publish it. He was the academic editor of maybe the major academic publisher in Europe. He said, I want to write it with you. I want to be a part of it with you. And in God's wonderful providence, my first book is with Heiko Obermann. And I'm, and I still actually, when it came out, I still had not finished my PhD, but he gave me a chance, and that chance opened up all kinds of opportunities for me as an academic. And so there are these wonderful providences that happen for folks, I think for Carolyn and for me, and we have felt God's hand upon our lives. And so this writing life that we've entered into, it really was, I think we both feel kind of called. People feel called to ministry. Well, this has been part of our ministry, and we have felt really called to it over the years. So those are the stories about how it happened for us. And they're kind of interesting, a little bit different, I suspect, from other folks. Let's shift now to the second part. And this is maybe where folks may want to, really ask different questions about the writing piece. And one of the things that's important as a writer, and you hear people talk about finding your voice, finding, one is that's part of finding your topic, what really animates you, how you approach a subject, and how you think about how you want to come across to your audience. Do you want to come across as a comedian? Do you want to come across as a Sunday school teacher? Do you want to come across as a person who writes to a broad audience but has a lot of academic depth? So you think about that, your voice. And I know that Carolyn and I have talked about that particularly when she first started writing. And one of the things that for me I'll start off, and Carolyn can jump in here in a few minutes. But this idea of finding your voice, it was fairly easy for me to find my voice because you kind of know academic writing is reporting information, if you will, and giving your analysis. But I've never felt that was adequate, even for an academic. I have always believed, partly I guess because I had my degree in English, my minor in English in college. And I've always taught my students over the years that it's not enough to be smart. It's not enough to have your facts straight. It's not enough to provide brilliant analysis. You've got to be able to communicate it in a way that people will hear it and receive it. And I said, you also have to not just report facts, but report the significance of those facts. So for me, being an academic writer includes writing well. I give as much attention to the sentence structure and to the choice of language that maybe a novelist might give. Maybe not the same, but I give a lot of thought to that, because I want what I do to have to be received and to be understood. I've always rejected the notion, and if you've read, some egghead academic books, sometimes they're so poorly written, you can't sort of follow the sentence structure, and it just your head explodes because of that. So what happens is you fail to communicate. You may be the most brilliant person in the world, but you fundamentally fail to communicate. It seems to me part of my own anthropology, my own theology, is that we as human beings are meant to communicate and to relate. And if you have ideas, but you can't communicate them, I feel like you have failed in your calling at a deep level. And for one other thing for me, just to mention, is that I feel very strongly in my calling as an academic, and that includes my writing. I am not called to provide a vision of history that sugarcoats the realities. I've always told, in almost every class, I've almost always said there are no heroes in church history. And that's because they're not. When you've done as much research as I have, and you get into their lives and the way they live, then you know that there are no heroes. Just one example that I'd given in the past. Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer of the 16th century, was a racist against the Jews. Did he say some profound things theologically? Yes. Was he quite a character and fun to read? Yes. But my job as a scholar who's trying to communicate is to tell the whole truth as best I can. And so that means I don't sugarcoat. So when it comes to John Calvin, I tell stories about burning of witches. And the witches, by the way, were mainly elderly, eccentric women who may have had mental illness, but they were burned at the stake because they were different. And so some of these heroes of the faith had feet of clay. And I have not provided a complete picture, a real picture, I should say, until I've given them a more complete picture of the individual. Quick story about how I've had a couple of issues over the years. I wrote a big textbook a few years ago on the history of Christianity from the Reformation to the present time. And I had a chapter on Billy Graham. And I tried to tell the truth. That is to say that he developed some of his ideas over time, and that there were some changes in his theology. I'd mentioned the fact that he regretted that he spent so much time away from his family doing his evangelistic events, and he wishes that he had been a better father. I have information on that. And he wishes he'd studied the Bible more and studied more theology, because he really didn't have much theological training. By the way, that's a PR bit for the importance of theological seminary. I think training is so important. And so Billy had some regrets, and I put that in the chapter. My co-author got upset, and he said, we can't expose Billy. And I said, my job isn't to puff Billy Graham to make him look good. My job is not to demean him, but is to tell the truth. And so my co-author, who's a good man, a wonderful man, went over my head, went to our publisher and said, Frank is not giving a good picture of Billy Graham, not adequate. What can you do about it? So the publisher came to me and said, Frank, you need to make Billy look better. I refused, because that's not my calling in life, is to make Billy look good or anybody else. Finally, because I was the author, they all finally backed down, and that was just it. But there are these, that story tells you that history is often written with a certain angle in mind. And in the mind of my co-author, part of it was to make evangelicals look good. And that has taught me a lot of lessons. I could go on here, but let me just end by saying this. I worry about some writers in my academic field tell part of the truth, but not the whole truth of a particular historical individual or historical movements. And one of the issues that I've seen over and over again is that these history textbooks often don't tell the story of minorities. They don't often tell the story of women. They don't tell the story of Native Americans when it comes to American history. And so what happens is you get a skewed view. And again, my calling as an academic has a moral component to it, an ethical component, that I am supposed to tell the truth as best I can. That doesn't mean I'm always right. It just means that I am really working hard to paint a complete picture. And sometimes when you do that, you get into a little bit of trouble. I'll turn over to Carolyn now and ask her to talk about why she writes and what have been animating features, and then some of the fallout that she's had to deal with as a writer. Carolyn, you want to take it away?
Well, one of the things that changed for me, and it was after I graduated from seminary, was, when I was in seminary, when I was growing up, all of my teachers were male. And you learn to look at the Bible through male eyes. And in all of this business of getting started writing, one of the things that happened was that I started to own my own female point of view. And it's missing in, the way the church looks at theology and biblical studies. There's a lot to dig out of the scriptures when you bring a different point of view. I mean, one of the examples that we heard was when Frank was in seminary here in Philly, and we went to a church where a deaf man preached a sermon on Jesus healing the deaf man, and he signed it. He signed his sermon, and it was all, somebody said the words to the rest of us, but it was a whole different way of looking at that narrative, because Jesus was signing to him. He took him aside from the crowd. He would touch him in ways that would convey to him he was going to deal with this problem. And when he prayed, he sighed. It was all very physical what Jesus did, and I had never noticed that. And I think one of the things in finding your voice is to own who you are and what you bring, the unique perspective you bring to the text. And there is so much more to dig out of scripture. I mean, I feel like we're on the edges of it. there's just I mean, that's what my books have done. I've done a lot with the stories of women in the Bible. I've done a ton on the book of Ruth, which is usually taught as a Cinderella story. It's not a Cinderella story. You have two women who are, one is a famine refugee and the other is an undocumented immigrant, so what do we know about those demographics that would shape the impact of that story? So there's that piece of it, to own your voice. The other thing that when you're writing a book is that and we've all done this, a reader can put you down. They can put you down and never pick you up again. If there's not if you don't hold their attention, they'll do that. And Frank was my coach when my first editor, all my books. And one of the things that he said to me is every paragraph needs to give birth to the next paragraph. And every chapter needs to lead into the next chapter. Because, like I said, you have to write for the reader. And my literary agent told me one time, when somebody picks up your book, they want to sit down with you and listen to you, but they don't want you talking at them. They want to feel like they've joined you in this conversation. And one of the things that I did, and at first I didn't do it by my own choice. I had a friend who set this up, but she set up a focus group for me of women. And so I would write a chapter or two, they would read it, and then we'd all sit down and talk. And I would get feedback. And after that, I would always have a group of friends who would read chapters for me. And I didn't want them to be my editor. What I wanted them to do was to tell me if they had to read a sentence twice to figure out what I was saying. Or, just if it flowed and if it made sense to them. And sometimes they would make suggestions that were helpful. But that was a real morale booster, to have somebody else looking at your words and giving you feedback. And so I think, those were important things. But I would really underscore, especially for the women, that you need to own your point of view. Culturally and as a woman, there are things in the text that even the best scholars don't see, that come across to us in a completely different way. A lot of the stories of women in the Bible are downsized. And yet, when you look at those stories against the patriarchal backdrop of their culture, it's the power of those stories increases. Like the one that I always use as an example is Mary of Bethany, who's the one I said was the first great New Testament theologian. But you have to put her whole story together. And it's in different places, so it gets broken apart. But when she sat at the feet of the rabbi as a rabbinical student, well, we hear sermons about, you need to have your quiet time, and you shouldn't get so busy that you neglect that. If you took that story to the girls in Afghanistan and showed them how Jesus responded when her sister said she belongs in the kitchen and she's in the wrong place, and he says, no, what she's doing here is the most important thing. Can you imagine what they would say about that story? So, but I'm just saying there's so much more there. And the story of women in the Bible is a powerful story because it's against that kind of a cultural backdrop, of an intensely patriarchal culture. And so every time a woman sets foot on the pages of scripture is a big deal. And there are women in the Bible that God gives a word to that never get credit for being prophets, like Hagar or Rebecca, you know, or Deborah. You know, there's just a lot there. And I'm having the time of my life, and every book I've written has taken me into new territory that have changed things for me in ways I never expected. So it's part of my journey. But one of the things that I felt early on when I started to ask different questions of the text and to look at as a woman was that it made me angry, because I just thought, this is not what we're being taught in the church. Like the book of Ruth. Scholars are looking at the book of Ruth as the story of a female Job, that Naomi is a female Job, and that Ruth is initiating the action. She's living out her vow all the way through the book of Ruth. And I'll never forget hearing a male professor say that that Ruth is the leader in the story. And she's having conversations with this powerful man. And she's talking to him about Mosaic law. She's talking to him about gleaning, about the kinsman redeemer law, and about the Levirate law. But she lives on the hungry side of the law, and it looks different from that point of view. And she leads him from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And when I heard that, it changed everything for me. I just thought, if Ruth, this Arab, she would be an Arab today. She is from Jordan. And she's a brand new convert to the faith. And yet she is God's point person to move his purposes forward for the world at that moment in time. And she's making these initiatives with Boaz that take him beyond the letter to the spirit of the law. And he goes with her every time he goes with her, because he's just that kind of a man. I mean, it's just one of the most powerful stories for my money, in the whole Old Testament, in such a picture of the gospel, because they're all making sacrifices for each other. And I've written 2 books on the book of Ruth, and I keep learning more from it. But I'm just saying, as women, we bring a unique perspective to the discussion of theology and scripture. And if I've learned anything from my writing, it's been that when I went to seminary, they were letting women come. And I went back later and spoke in chapel there, and I said, you need us here. and I believe that, that every different perspective that we bring to the text just is going to give us a richer understanding of God's word. Okay, I'll shut up.
No. I was going to tell everybody that there have been 3 people in this marriage: Carolyn, me, and Ruth. I've been hearing about Ruth for 20 years and learning a lot about all of that.
Well, it's never been one of the things you get caught in when you're a female writer in the American church is the debate about women. And it never, I was always interested in it, but it never answered questions for me, because my family would have taken me out and shot me if I said I wanted to be a pastor. And, so that was just never a question I was interested in. personally, although the discussion was always interesting to me. And, for a long time, I was single, and I'm thinking, how does this business of being a wife and mother communicate to me? And I wanted to write books that talk to all of us. And I've had little girls in middle school read my books, and I've had elderly women in their 90s read them and say, I'm asking God what he wants me to do with the rest of my life. And it's just been, wonderful to say, oh, this is for all of us. It's not just for women who want to be pastors. It's not just for wives and mothers. It's for little girls, and it's for elderly women. And there's no starting point. It starts when you're born, and it goes all the way through your life. And, and it's true for men too. Your calling isn't something you earn. It's something you're born with as God's image bearer. And it's been really exciting to see a fire lit under so many people, because it's done that to me. It just, like he says, we live with Ruth, but I just thought, if this is what God called her to do, then why not me? Who does it leave out when she comes in as completely in the margins, and God has chosen her to move his purposes forward for the world, and she never knew it. It's amazing.
It's a very powerful story. And I think I can say that, on the one hand, as in our marriage, the discoveries, being a writer and doing research and trying to think about the implications of whether it's my academic side of things or whether it's your side of things, the biblical side of things, those insights have enriched our marriage. I never want to miss that point. So the writer's life for us has been a marriage builder, because we're very engaged and listening and asking, Carolyn, do you really mean to say that? Or do you really want to go in that direction? And it has, I think Carolyn would say the same thing, but the questions that come about as a result of writing and doing research, and the fact that we share and we do it together, all the time, it has really enriched our relationship. I know who Carolyn really is by the kinds of questions she asks. I know I know who she really, really is. And I would say she really knows who I am, for better or for worse. She really does know who I am. She knows the kinds of questions I wrestle with as a writer, as a thinker, as a teacher. So the writer's life, there's a spiritual quality for a Christian writer. There can be, and I would argue should be, a spiritual nourishment that comes from that. One of the things that our time is getting close here, but one of the things that Carolyn has said over the years, and I want to ask her to say just a bit about this, is in almost every case of every book she's written, it's true of me to a lesser extent, but more true of her, that every book that she intended to write, the book that she set out to write, was not the book she actually wrote. That the books took on a life of their own. And that's what happens when you're reading and researching, and things start to build a momentum that you didn't even anticipate. So Carolyn, would you talk about that just for a second? If you, any thoughts about that?
Well, I'm asking questions, and I think the books that I've written have a lot to do about my own journey. And so when I wrote the book about the first book that I wrote about women in theology, I wanted to know if God made us to be theologians. You know, did he create us for this? And so I did research into Genesis 1 and 2, and that has birthed all kinds of new insights. But that's where I looked at the word that's used for the women in Genesis 2, because before I was married, when I was growing up, and then when I had a decade of singleness after college, and I always felt like I was on the outside of that conversation because the helper was always the wife. And my dad taught me that he thought it was a spiritual helper that God created. But I looked up the word that's used for the women. And, the debate had sort of, they did an inventory of how the word was used in the Old Testament. It's used 21 times, and it's used twice for the women in Genesis 2, 3 times for nations that Israel is asking them to send their armies because they're under attack. And the remaining 16 times it's used for God as the helper of his people. And I went and looked up all those words because in the debate, what they decided was that, okay, she's a strong helper because it's used for God so many times. But they would say, how strong is she? So then the debate, resumed over that. Well, I looked up all the words and I found that every time that word appears in the Old Testament, it's used in a military context. There's always military language. The nations send armies when God is our shield and defense. In better than chariots and horses, every single text had military imagery in it. Then I went back to the Garden of Eden and I thought, the Garden of Eden is a war zone. There's an enemy in the garden. And there are dangerous trees. And the man is commanded to guard the garden. And that's military language. And they're told to rule and subdue, which means they're going to have resistance. And I concluded from that the Azer is the female. It's not the wife. It's the female. And that she is a warrior. That God was creating real help for the woman to join the man in the battle for his kingdom. And that it's built on Genesis 1, the same thing coming together. Well, that was new to me. And, I have little girls who think of themselves as Azers and elderly women who do too, because that's the female. And, the only reference to marriage in that text comes at the very end of chapter 2 in a very anti-patriarchal statement, where it says that a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife. Under patriarchy, it works the opposite way. The wife becomes the property of her husband's family. So, right there at the beginning, that's another thing that I've run into a lot is how the Bible dismantles patriarchy instead of proclaiming it. But it's, every book, as I get into it and I'm asking questions for myself, I want to understand, is this speaking to me? And then the vista of audience has gotten bigger and bigger, where I have to ask, how does this impact women in other places in the world? This is not an American book. It's for the world. And so how are we interpreting the Bible in ways that only work in a Western American culture? So that's, it's a venture. Every book has taken me into new territory. And yes, it's gotten me into lots of trouble, more than I would like. but yeah, and it's work. Writing is hard work, and we haven't talked much about that, but it's hard work.
Yeah, I think one of the things that people often think is, I'll just sit down and it'll kind of naturally flow. And the truth of the matter is, and you really look at any writer, whether they're a novelist or whatever kind of writer they are, they will all tell you that it never comes easy. It's always hard work. And I often say that writing is rewriting. So if you're looking for a tidbit about what the writer does, it's always about rewriting. The first draft you write is never the final. Carolyn just finished a chapter recently, and I think you went through, is it fair to say 15 drafts of that?
Yeah, I mean, it just sort of takes on a life of its own, and it just, you want it to hang together, and you don't want to lose your reader, and
it takes a lot of perseverance to go back to the same chapter and rewrite it 15, 16 times. But that's how hard, a good writer, and that's not unique to Carolyn, it's not unique to me. It is all good writers have to go through that process. And it can be anguishing, it's frustrating, but that is, I think of all the things that I think about for a good writer, is a willingness to hang in there and to rewrite again and again.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Because I would like to know, the size of this group is a good one to ask a question, but I would be interested to know, why are you interested in writing? Or have you already been writing books?
Well, I'll say something. Hi, I'm Nicole. So I've started 1 million books and have not completed one. So I have them in me, and I actually after I got out of school, I kind of actually working on this one because I have a lot to say and I have a lot to teach, and it's like it wants to get out of me. But it's just like I've been to 1 million different places on how to do this, how to do that, but it's just that part of, okay, what's the next step? Having the support, not having the support. And but yeah, for me, it's just there's a lot of stuff in me that I want to get out and teach what I've learned in my life.
One way that's good to start is with a blog, because you get into the practice of writing. If you go on social media and link your articles up, you start to build a following. But I often tell people to do that, because it's just because the publisher's going to always ask what they ask me, is how big is your tribe? And
yeah, I think it's a really important point to make, Carolyn, is that it's hard to get published, particularly if you're talking about any of the standard Christian publishers. You got to remember, they're in it to make money. They may love Jesus, but they love money. They can't survive without having is asking the question, is this book going to sell? Is there a market for this? And I think that was that's really important. And so the bottom line is, it's hard to get noticed. It's hard to get published. Carolyn's idea is great. I think that's one way to build up. I mean, you have to make a case. Carolyn's had to do this too. When she first got published, she had to provide some data to the publisher about how many women would be interested in a book that was theologically oriented, that was asking the question, about theology and women. And one of the things that we did, I think Carolyn had a number of friends, women, and Carolyn asked the women to write letters to the publisher telling them, no more fluff. We don't want that stuff. We want real stuff. We want real theological, in-depth studies that's accessible. And I think that was one of the, I don't know how, there are a lot of them who wrote of your friends.
They
And
were
I think
angry.
they were semi-hostile.
Stop.
And it was amazing. I think the funny part of the story is the editor-in-chief, if I have the story correctly, he had these letters from all these women saying, this is the kind of thing we want. And he finally went to what's called the pub board. That is the group, in this case, all males who had to make the decision whether to publish Carol or not. The executive editor turned to everybody and said, look, how did he say it, Carolyn? He said,
I think we need to trust the women on this.
We need to trust the women on this. And it turned out to be both lucrative for the publisher and it made sense. And it launched Carolyn's career. So but my point that I want to get, is it's hard to get published. It is not easy. And, that doesn't mean you should stop. I think one of the things I wanted to say to everyone is that Carolyn started a national organization called the Synergy Network for Women. That's now been folded into something called Missio Alliance. But one of the things that Carolyn did at her national conferences is that she invited publishers to come to her conferences. And so there were always big publishers coming in and listening to people, men and women, pitching their ideas. So I tell you that because Carolyn and I both have had a long-standing interest in seeing men and women published, Christian men who are thoughtful, Christian women who are thoughtful, and really have something important to say. There's been a long-standing interest in promoting Christian writers, good Christian writers. And so I think we could end by saying we encourage you, find a group of people that you trust and start sending them what you're writing. A group of men, a group of women, men and women. And you're going to have to develop a thick skin. Let me just assure you of that. People are going to say, that doesn't quite make sense, or your point isn't well taken here. So to become a writer, you've got to develop a thick skin. All of us can be criticized. All of us can do better. I sometimes tell the story. I had a student who was very bright in Orlando, and he wrote a paper for me. It was an academic paper. And he sort of had ideas, I'd like to maybe think of myself as a theologian. And he brought the paper to me and I said, this is good. I said, do it again. And he went back and he rewrote it and he brought it to me again. I said, this is better. Do it again. And he was trying to get a grade. He came back a third time and he worked on it. I said, this is even better. I said, do it again. And he looked up at me in my office and he said, Dr. James, I hate you. But when he finished that fourth draft, he had quality that, it was publishable. That's how good it was. And I could see in this young man that he had talent, that he had ability. He had ability that he didn't know he had, but I had to pull it out of him in a way. And so he had to develop a thick skin with me because I'm pushing him. I pushed him almost beyond his limits. I mean, it's kind of, if you're in a class trying to get a grade from a professor and you tell that professor you hate them to their face, you know you've pushed them pretty far. But he had to develop thick skin, and he had to develop a sense that he could actually do better. And so I kind of just almost brutally pulled out more from him than he knew he had. So as you think about writing, you need people who will speak truth to you and say, this stinks, or this is really insightful. I would say research.
Dr. James. Dr.
Yes.
James. The other piece of it is that sometimes you have to fight for what you want to say. And that's
Yes.
because the first book I wrote, there was a chapter in there and he said, you don't need this chapter. And I said, yeah, I need this chapter. and it turned out I was right, but it was, that's good too. And because he'll read my stuff and I'll say, I don't think you need that. And I go, I need that. I make it better. But so some of that is you have to fight for your work too.
But have you developed a thick skin over the years? Tell him. I tell you, we're running out of time here, but tell quickly the story of the first time you wrote your first chapter, your first draft, and I looked at it. You sent it to me.
Yeah. He wasn't very nice. He came in and he said, I don't have much time to talk, but he said, you could do a lot better than this.
You got to.
I read a chapter. I'm so excited. But anyway, he was right, but it took me 2 weeks to go back to it. It was pretty deflating.
Yeah, I've had to learn how to be a little more diplomatic in my editing. But you got to remember, I was used to marking up student papers in red and saying, I was always a very engaged professor with papers.
You're a great editor. You really are. I couldn't do this without you.
But she's had to develop a thicker skin, and I've so anyway, I've had to learn how to be a little more diplomatic. But for all of you who are writers and aspiring writers, you need that interaction. I don't think good writers write in isolation. Good writers always have, whether it's one person or 10, who will give you that kind of honest feedback and say, you can do this differently. And Carolyn's right. You may decide that the people who've offered their opinions about your writing, that they're wrong. They're dead wrong, and you have to fight for it.
Yeah.
There's also that dimension to it, and there have been a number of times when I felt like that Carolyn devoted a chapter or something. I said, I'm not sure that fits and everything, and she says it fits, and of course she's the author, so she wins. Well, brothers and sisters, I think we've gone about our time, and maybe we can do this again. We want to encourage good writing, writing that will impact people's lives, to love the Lord more, that will enhance our love of Scripture. We want that to be the case. So with that.
So before you sign off, I just have one thing. I just want to thank you both for sharing with us this evening and for making it very relaxed and helpful and engaging.
Yes.
And I also want to let everyone know that we have two very exciting events coming up. We have Faith in the Justice System on November 18th. We have great panelists and a moderator who we're going to really answer those difficult questions when it comes to faith in our communities. So if you are available, we do encourage you to attend in person. It will be, there will be safety protocols in place or live stream. The other event is the Afghan refugee webinar, which is called Gracious Hospitality. This is November 11th from 7 to 8, and this will be webinar format that will be streamed later on. But thank you so much, everyone, for participating. We look forward to another session, and we hope you all have a wonderful, blessed night and that you enjoyed your time this evening, found it helpful and informative.